In this video, I'm going to walk you through the super basics of typing JavaScript, the basic rules that you need to follow in order to get it to work. To do that, I'm going to walk you through Lesson 3 of Code.org's Event-Driven Programming, Unit 3. This is from their Computer Science Discoveries course. So in this lesson overview, we're asking how can we communicate to a computer how to draw shapes on the screen. That's our goal. We're going to draw shapes. So I'm going to introduce you to GameLab. We're going to position some shapes on the screen, and we're going to look at some debugging and some simple commands. So by the end of all these bubbles, you should be able to make a drawing tool like they showed you in Lesson 2. So vocab, bug, we've already covered this. If you got a bug in your program, it's something that doesn't work correctly. Originally, again, history lesson, the first bug ever was an actual bug. It was a moth. Debugging is fixing, and then your program is all of your code that you wrote. So we're going to learn 3 new bits of code in this lesson: the fill command, the ellipse command, and the rect command. Let's dive in. So, welcome to GameLab. You can create interactive animations in games. You've already practiced the basics of putting shapes on a grid. That was actually from an unplugged lesson. In GameLab, you'll do the same with the display area on the left. Look at the line of code in the workspace below these instructions. That's right here, and I've already switched it to text mode. And discuss with your partner, I'm just going to discuss out loud, where you think the shape will be drawn on the grid. So rect, as you can see in the toolbox, gets an X and a Y. It has 2 parameters. So rect is actually a function that Code.org made for us, and when we call this function, we do that by typing in the name of the function, and then in parentheses we put in 2 arguments to give those parameters values. So the X value is 100, the Y value is also 100. Where is that going to show up? Well, first thing to notice is that if you mouse over the drawing area, you can see the coordinates of where your mouse is, and I can see that if I move right here, there's 100, 100, roughly. So my question in my head is, I think it's going to draw a rectangle. That's what I think rect means. Is it going to put the corner of the rectangle where my cursor is, or is that going to be the center of the rectangle or the bottom? Let's run it and find out. Okay, looks like 100, 100 was the upper left corner of the rectangle. So that's an important thing to know. Change the numbers inside the block, then try running it again. Okay. A lot of times, by the way, you got to hit reset before it will let you change it. So let's change the 200 on the X, and that moved it to the right. X value is right and left. Let's put a 300 in here. Kind of curious to know what happens if I put it off the screen a little bit. So I'm going to change this to 380 just to see. And it does, it draws it. Try to place the rectangle near the bottom right of the screen. Well, let's show our grid. That's a handy thing, isn't it? So each major line here is 100, and if I go back to 100, 100, I can see that the size of this rectangle is 50 by 50. So I bet I want the corner to be right there. That's going to be 450. Oops, no, 350, because 400 is the right edge, and 350 for the Y. Handy tricks that you're going to need when you are creating shapes inside of the area. So great, I did it. I'm going to hit finish. And already we're doing a little bit of typed JavaScript. When you're working through, you need to watch these videos, but I am going to skip over it to keep this one a little shorter. Placing squares in the corners. Now, I'm going to take a little side trip. I'm going to look at the JavaScript here. I'm going to put away the toolbox, the instructions. Actually, I'm going to keep the toolbox. And I'm going to put some more rectangles in here. So I hit enter and added a new line. And we're going to talk about some things you can and can't do in JavaScript. So the first thing you can do in JavaScript is you can leave empty spaces, and JavaScript will ignore those. So if I put a new rectangle in here at 250, 250 and run it, it's okay with that empty space. I can put in lots of empty spaces if I want, just to make my code look more organized. Go ahead and do that. You also may have noticed that I put a space after my comma in the arguments, but code.org didn't. That's white space, again, that JavaScript doesn't care about. Okay. Notice when you're typing JavaScript, at the end of every line there is this thing. That is called a semicolon, and that is typed with your right pinky finger. You're going to get really good at typing those because there's one at the end of every line in JavaScript. What happens if I don't do it? Well, right away I get this little warning in the gutter, and it tells me when I mouse over right away that it's missing a semicolon. Will it run? It still will run. Okay, be careful about that though. JavaScript, it tries to figure out what you mean, but if you screw it up badly enough, sometimes it can't figure out what you mean. This time it could because it was pretty simple, but not always. So develop good habits. Don't screw up on that punctuation. Speaking of punctuation, there's a comma in the middle of here. What if I get rid of that and I just have a space? Ooh, now I get a red error block. And it won't even run. I get a full-on error that pops up in the debug console, and something that hopefully will... Oh, interesting. It says line 5. I wonder why it didn't say line 3. Whatever. Notice that the error doesn't say you're missing a comma. It says expected parenthesis and instead saw 250, missing semicolon. Right? It's expecting something that wasn't there. It's doing its best to figure out what you mean, but it couldn't. So don't skip the commas. Another thing that JavaScript's picky about. If I use a capital R here and run it, I don't get my second rectangle. I get an error message. Rect hasn't been declared yet. See, there's a difference between lowercase r and uppercase R rect. So capitalization matters in JavaScript when you're typing. Okay. Extra spaces sometimes you can't put in. So like inside of there I could put that space in there, but that doesn't always work depending on where you put it. If I put a space between rect and the arguments, JavaScript figured it out at this time because we got lucky. But in general, you should not put this space here. Okay? That's not the correct syntax. What if I'm missing a parenthesis? Error. Syntax error. Right? Hopefully you are starting to get to the point that you really want to get your punctuation correct in JavaScript. The next thing I want to talk about is the parameters in functions, the arguments. Okay, when you mouse over a command that they give you, if you don't understand what to put in there, then you can mouse over here and hit See Examples, and it will give you a little overview of this function, and it will give you some example code to read through. Super useful. Basically what this is telling me is that I've got a function called rect that I can use, and it expects two arguments, x and y. What if I try to draw a rectangle without x and y and just leave it empty? I will tell you that sometimes that will work. Right? It depends on how they coded it. If they coded it so that there's a default x and y, then you can go ahead and do that, and it'll still run. But in this case, we can see something a little bit more insidious, something a little bit scarier, is it did not give me an error message, right? It ran, but it didn't show anything on the screen. It didn't draw a rectangle at the same time. Okay, so sometimes JavaScript, you have bugs, but sometimes JavaScript doesn't complain about them. So be careful. Rect expects an x and a y. What if I don't understand what that means and I actually type in x and y? now I get an error. Oops, we can't figure out what x is. Okay. You need to know what those parameters are supposed to be. X and y are numbers. If we don't know that they're numbers, then you need to read the documentation, and you can see in here that the arguments they put in are numbers. If you try to put in something else, like let's say I put in a couple of strings, same scary deal. I don't get a rectangle on the screen. I don't get an error message either. I've got a mismatch on the types of my arguments. My arguments need to be numbers in this case. You can end up with other things that are bugs that are not errors, like I just put in 500, 500. Where's my rectangle? Well, in fact, it does exist, because remember, my grid only goes up to 400, comma 400 in the corner. So I just drew a rectangle down here off the screen. If I fix that, then we'll see it. Okay. So, super important stuff. I know that this video isn't necessarily the most exciting thing you've ever seen, but these error patterns that I'm showing you are things that crop up every year when students are learning JavaScript. Computers are very literal. They don't necessarily know what you mean, like a human knows what you mean, but a computer doesn't. You have to be exact. See if I'm doing anything else missing. What if I skip one argument here? 300, and that's it. Same sort of error as before. It's a quiet error. It's expecting 2 arguments. I only gave it 1. Watch out for that sort of stuff. Happy coding. Keep going with this. They'll give you more commands as you go along. Remember that the documentation is available at any time, and it's very helpful.